Well, I'm joined now by the Labour Party Chair and Shadow Women and Equalities Secretary, Anneliese Dodds, for Labour's view on the stories of the day. Welcome to you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. A quick thought, first of all, to the news that we heard this morning that Theresa May was standing down. What do you make of that?
Good morning. I mean, I first of all would, of course, want to wish her all the very best for the future. I think this is the end of an era. Theresa May's been in government for in Parliament for 27 years and, of course, held extremely high office as Prime Minister. I do think it's interesting, however, that we see obviously today Theresa May saying that she'd stand down, but we've seen a really large number of other Conservative members of Parliament saying they'd stand down, including some MPs who've barely been in Parliament for just a few years. So there's quite a big exodus of Conservative MPs at the moment, and I think that just indicates that for many Conservatives as well as the country, now is the time for change. We do need to see that general election, and we need to see it urgently.
Well, of course, Labour does want a general election, something that you do call for most times that we chat. But let's also get your reaction to other news that we've been covering that's been developing overnight. The US are planning to build a port in Gaza to get more humanitarian aid in. Is that something that you welcome?
Well, we're desperately concerned about the humanitarian catastrophe that's unrolling in Gaza. It really is a truly appalling situation. We're seeing now, as well as obviously the continued impact of fighting, real concerns about malnutrition continuing within Gaza, particularly strong impact on children. And so Labour has consistently been calling for far stronger provision of aid to Gaza. We need to see much stronger action from the international community. But we have also said that we do need to see an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Now, many countries are calling for this. Labour has added our voice to that call. Of course, Parliament did vote for that recently overall. We believe that's necessary so we can get the hostages out, so aid can be got in, and so there can actually be a political, diplomatic process towards a two-state solution that's so necessary.
OK, let me ask you about defence spending, because the Public Accounts Committee has today raised concerns about what they say is a shortfall being spent on defence. They say there's no credible plan to fund our armed forces, or the armed forces that the country wants. Are we spending enough on defence?
Well, we are really concerned about the situation. When Labour left office in 2010, we were spending 2.5% of our GDP on defence, and throughout that period we had an average of over 100,000 people within our armed forces. So what are your plans, were you to get into government? How much money would you spend on defence? So what we would do immediately is we would conduct a defence and security strategic review. Now, the government has not done that, so it doesn't have an accurate picture of exactly where there needs to be change, where there would need to be, for example, different approaches to spending. We've identified that there's been, unfortunately, a significant amount of waste in the government's approach. That's amounted to many billions of pounds. We've also identified that our brave armed forces far too often are living in appalling conditions. That's why we said there needs to be a focus on armed forces accommodation. So, of course, we would make sure the armed forces had the finances that they need.
OK.
But we would also make sure that ultimately our brave members of the armed forces are treated properly and that that money is spent wisely, because it has not been spent wisely by the current government.
So you're saying that you would spend the money to make sure that the armed forces have what they need. So will you commit to spending 2.5% of GDP on defence?
Well, that was ultimately the case when Labour left office in 2010, as I said.
So is it your ambition for the next Parliament? Our
ambition is to make sure that our armed forces are adequately funded, and also that that funding and spending is allocated wisely. We're talking about taxpayers' money here. That's why we would conduct that review. And as I said, we're deeply concerned that we've not seen that kind of root and branch analysis from government over the last 14 years. And as a result, I think we're seeing now the impact, sadly, on our capability. You know, the first responsibility of any government is actually to protect our country and to keep its people safe.
So you say you'd spend the money that the armed forces need, but where would money come from in an instance like that? I mean, Labour has this problem that the Tory party pinched 2 of their ideas in the budget. They're going to spend the money that you wanted to raise as well. They're going to spend it on tax cuts. You were going to spend it on other elements of public service. So where's the money going to come from for defence and for those public service commitments?
Well, Labour will always set out exactly how we would pay for all of our commitments. We've seen the impact, of course, under the Conservatives, particularly under Liz Truss, of setting out unfunded commitments, in her case unfunded tax cuts, and there's lots of people paying the price for that still with higher mortgage payments today. So Labour will always set out that detail. But I have to say, in terms of the U-turns that you just mentioned coming from the government this week on non-dom taxation, if you think about the period of time that the Conservatives wasted when they could have put in place that taxation on people who live here but don't pay tax here, that could have paid for 3.8 million procedures in our NHS. I think it's an important point because they kept arguing against it.
OK, fine.
And they could have used that money for positive things for our country.
So you've made that point, but I want to find out if there's any clarity here that you can share with the public, because the Institute for Fiscal Studies has said that the government and you are in a conspiracy of silence about the realities that face the next Parliament, that there's going to be a huge hit on spending. They say that you're not being honest about that, but you're saying here you want to give the armed forces the money they have, the money that they need, but people will ask, where will that money come from?
Well, that's why Labour will always set out exactly how we will pay for our commitments, and we would be taking different choices to the Conservatives. You know, obviously, as we just talked about, they took a very long time, unfortunately, to say they would change that non-dom tax regime. But also Labour said, for example, that private schools shouldn't benefit from not being charged VAT and business rates when the schools that 90% of kids attend don't have the resources that they need. We've been really clear and upfront about that choice, also about the choice to be closing loopholes in private equity taxation so that we can adequately fund our mental health services, and so on and so forth. So we would be taking different choices to the government, and we will set out exactly how we will pay for our commitments in the run-up to the general election. Again, a big contrast with how the Conservatives have operated recently.
OK, Anneliese Dodds, we appreciate your time. Thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Pleasure.